Another edition of Beat the Closing Number presented by TheLines.com. I'm Eli Hershkovich, joined by Anthony Dabbundo. You can follow him on X at Anthony Dabbundo of The Ringer, doing great write-ups, soccer now. He's veered away from college basketball. He's no longer a college hoops degen, but he is getting back into it. You could hear his takes on the One Shining podcast and the Ringer Gambling Show, along with write-ups throughout the NCAA tournament over at The Ringer. Anthony, how does it feel to be back into the college basketball March Madness realm these days?
Yeah, part of, the new role, I was over at the Action Network where, College Hoops daily stuff filled my life from, really December through March. This year, I've still been betting it kind of quietly, but I haven't been doing content. And there is a difference, right? So, I don't feel as obliged to do it every day. I can take a day off and nobody cares. It's kind of just my own personal little thing, but it's good to be kind of back in the content space because it is the best few weeks of the year, doing some conference tournament stuff last week over at The Ringer. And of course now the NCAA tournament, really the finest sports weekend of the year, in my opinion. And yeah, the soccer stuff, we always have had the soccer there. We still love soccer. In fact, Team USA plays Panama tomorrow night at 7. Which is a pretty big game, but
please,
really brutal.
If I see you tweet about that once, you're blocked.
There will be a screen dedicated for that. I will say that, but yeah, we're locked in for this weekend. We have an international break, so that is a good time for me to fully be locked in here.
All right. Well, the people want your college basketball takes. We have first round picks for you. 8 games to get to, 7 bets. So be sure to stay tuned throughout the show. You won't want to leave this one. A bunch of bets headed your way for Thursday and Friday action in March Madness. As Anthony said, the best time of the year, no better way to say it. And you can head over to play.thelines.com if you want to predict the final 16 teams in the field. It's a free contest and you can win $1,000. So no reason why not to head over to play.thelines.com for that. Check out the best sportsbook promos over at thelines.com as well. We'll touch on UNC and Ole Miss as we're recording this here on Wednesday, March 19th in the afternoon for contest. We'll get into the first 4, or at least the high major result between UNC and San Diego State. The Tar Heels covering, blowing out the Aztecs, and advancing to play the 6th-seeded Ole Miss Rebels on Friday in the South region. So that game, back half of the show, if you want to stay tuned for that, any Tar Heels fans or bettors out there. But, Anthony, let's get started with the South region, actually. Thursday afternoon, first game on the board. We know bettors are going to be firing left and right on first to 10, first to 20 in the 8-9 matchup. The Louisville Cardinals against the 9-seeded Creighton Blue Jays. Louisville opened as a 1.5-point favorite, quickly bet up to -2.5 as we touched on before we got started. This one has been stale-ish at -2.5 pretty much all week. And -135 on Louisville is where it sits on the money line. Total, really quickly, if I pull it up here, is 145.5. Similarly, across the board, no real disparity in that market either. So we're going to have differing takes on this game. I haven't fired a bet on it yet, but without further ado, how are you looking at this one, Anthony?
Yeah, so I went and pulled up the last few seasons. I think I've bet Creighton in just about every tournament game that they've played for 2 years. Even last year with the miracle cover against Oregon in double overtime, and then they came up short against Tennessee. But I have loved this
was
Creighton
that
team.
Double overtime?
Yeah, the famous Cousinard was going off, and they couldn't stop the rim running from Dante, and then they ran out of gas, and then Creighton covered in double overtime. It was great, and I loved those versions of Creighton. I just don't really think this Creighton is nearly as efficient as the past years. They don't have the same level of shooting, and I think Louisville has enough guys. One, they can throw Hepburn at Ashworth to kind of limit his ability to run this offense, and two, I think you have to have guys who can hit shots, dribble creators off the bounce against the caulk drop, the famed caulk drop. And I think Louisville has that. And I think, in the matchup of guards here, I'm going to take Hepburn over Ashworth every day. So I laid it -135 with Louisville. Again, it's a little sacrilegious. It feels a little weird to be against my Blue Jays, but I really have not loved this Creighton team nearly as much. And the big shot volume discussion that dominates the nerdery of college hoops now, like Louisville does project to have considerable advantages there too.
If you want to see a post that pretty much is a disclaimer of how big of a nerd Anthony is, check out his X page. I saw your eyeballs pop there. Check out his X page and look at his welcome back to baseball post. Is that fair?
Yeah, there's a running joke from a few years ago on Twitter and the guy's like telling his kid to be quiet because he's calculating win probability. So the Phillies are back next Thursday. I have partial season tickets, so like they're my most popular fan team, like the team I root for the most. Not even betting aside. People call me Dabbundo. Aaron Nola's my favorite Philly. You can find me calculating win probability in section 136, defending Schwarber as leadoff hitter, or complaining about leaving in a starter too long. So that's kind of and the Tate Frazier had a joke. It was like the media mafia, the metric media mafia, is what he calls the nerds who are like, actually UNC should be in the field because their Ken Pom is good. Those are kind of you're part of that too. So we'll
but I'm not just staring at KenPom.
That's true.
Because there are people like that. We both know those people who solely look at KenPom ratings as their Bible. But going back to one of your points in the handicap, you mentioned drop coverage, famously with Ryan Kalkbrenner. If you look at three of the best 3-point shooters, this one I'll give you to an extent that Creighton has faced this year. Solo ball, 0 of 4 from 3 in the first matchup against the Jays, then 3 of 5, then 2 of 5. Eric Dixon, 4 of 7, 1 of 5 in Villanova's 2 matchups against Creighton. And then Ryan Conwell, one of the best 3-point shooters in the tournament, 4 of 8, 4 of 6. So they have struggled against elite shooters, but all of those guys are really good shot creators off the dribble. So the one caveat to the Louisville handicap of this, if Terrence Edwards goes off, so be it. I think Louisville wins the game like he did for about a half against Duke in the ACC tournament semifinal. But Renee Smith, who is expected to play, we have no idea if he's close to 100%, 90%. Rumors were that he could have played in the ACC tournament if it was an NCAA tournament game, but all that stuff is kind of hogwash. They're rumors, it's hearsay. You never know with that kind of stuff. I think Creighton matches up well against Renee Smith, regardless of if he's 50%, 60%, 70%, or 100%, just because he's not an elite shot creator off the dribble. He's a really good shooter, and he can space out Creighton's drop coverage. But that said, he's not solo ball. He's not Ryan Conwell. And he's not the other elite shooters that Creighton has faced in Big East play, like Eric Dixon, who's a 3-level scorer, one of the best scorers in college basketball as a stretch big nationally. Statistically, he is one of the best scorers in the country, despite the fact that Villanova couldn't get into the NCAA tournament. Now, the other concern I have for Louisville, they rank well in terms of post-up defense, and obviously they've had injuries throughout the season. Scott statistically grades out well in that category. But you go back to when in the ACC Tournament Championship, not to harp on that game entirely, but Duke had a lot of success down low. Now, I know Malowacz and Kalkbrenner are two very different players. Kalkbrenner is a stretch big to an extent, or more of one, to say the least, than Malowacz. But Malowacz 4 of 6 at the rim, or 5 of 6 actually, at the rim in that game. And you said it well. Hepburn could take away Ashworth. But when Creighton is at its best, I think in Creighton's wins, Kalkbrenner is averaging more than 22 points a game. In their losses, just over 13 points a game. So, yeah, Hepburn against Ashworth, maybe that negates some of Creighton's effectiveness offensively. But if Kalkbrenner is dominating down low, or at least to a certain degree, which I think he'll have a fair amount of success in this game, despite the fact that Louisville has good post-up defense overall. Like I mentioned, Malowacz against Louisville last weekend. There's a path where the line is a bit inflated. I'm going to wait to see if I can get a 3. But if not, you could check out our newsletter right before tip. I may have a bet on Creighton pregame or live. Either way, I'm Oppo you on this one.
That's fine. One thing I will say is that I have a pro ACC bias in this tournament. I think, generally speaking, we kind of overreact to what we see in the non-con, and this has played out in a few tournaments now. And we can kind of talk about SEC and Big 12 and Mountain West and ACC and how these certain leagues have performed. When everybody's dying to tell you how good or bad a league is, in the case of the SEC, how good the SEC is, and we'll get into that later, and how bad the ACC is, I tend to think we're probably a little biased by what we just saw in small non-conference samples. And so maybe the ACC, which has overperformed March expectations more than any league in the last 2 or 3, 4 years, maybe it's the ACC that's a little underrated in March. And certainly, I mean, with this ranking, with the seed as an 8 seed, I do think that Louisville, and maybe you could argue Creighton too, are a little underrated, underseeded coming into this tournament.
See, my take is actually the antithetical of that. And I do think the ACC is undervalued to an extent in the market. I think that take is, at least for me, I think the Big East is undervalued in this tournament. And that sounds crazy because UConn won back-to-back national titles, but they're an 8 seed. And granted, the market has bet them up from 4.5 to 5.5 against Oklahoma. But before the market steam came in on some other teams in this conference, probably Creighton being the exception, I think you could argue the ACC is certainly undervalued to a certain extent, as I said. But I think the Big East throughout this tournament is going to prove some naysayers wrong, because there has been that take throughout the season. Well, UConn has dropped off, and so has the entire conference. And keep in mind, they only had, 3 teams in the tournament last year?
Yeah, Marquette really fell off in the second half. Xavier ended up like a true bubble team. Villanova hasn't been as good the last few years, and then obviously UConn at the top. So yeah, the league is not as dominant, but we've seen the Big East teams have had success in March as well. So, that kind of gets back to the original point about just kind of like maybe we shouldn't overreact to what we see in the non-con, because once you get to January 1st, your opinion of a conference can't really change. The joke about the SEC going 500, like
Carl Rabbit.
Yeah, Oklahoma's 6 and whatever in the SEC, 6 and 12 or 14, whatever, 14th place in the SEC, and we say that as a tribute to the league and how good it is. But what if it's just a statement on how bad Oklahoma is? That they ran good in the non-con to get where they got, and you're seeing that in the market. UConn, I saw as low as 2.5 with the first opener, now up over 5. So the markets liked UConn a lot. They were trading well above in the Big East tournament too, well above where you thought they would in those quarterfinal, semifinal games. So I'm not too surprised.
In the semis.
Yeah, they close -4.5 against Creighton.
Right. And there was a little bit of double overtime steam mixed in with the Jays coming off of the double overtime game against DePaul. But I'm with you on your point.
Yeah. So this is a fun game. It's a really interesting first matchup. And traditionally,
Pat
lose
Kelsey,
my first bet.
Greg McDermott. Like, this is a borderline, dare I say, elite coaching matchup.
I would agree. I thought Greg was going to be Indiana's next coach, but apparently not.
Yeah, they got a home run hire. One of my friends who's an Indiana alum has the take. I actually haven't heard this out there yet, and we'll get back to games in a second. But he's of the conspiracy theorists that Indiana made the call for West Virginia, and Indiana to miss the NCAA tournament so they could get DeVries as their coach, which honestly isn't that crazy, because if both teams are in the tournament, I don't know who Indiana gets. It's not
might have
DeVries.
run another week. You never know. Also, well, the conspiracy runs even deeper now because it's reached X. Twitter has picked up on it. DeVries had this injury that he's been missing,
right?
And he's got another year of eligibility now. And it's like, oh wait, was DeVries like secretly masterminding all of this weeks ago when he realized that the team didn't really have the juice and they were kind of fading down the stretch, and they got smoked in the conference tournament by a pretty mediocre Colorado team. So people are looking around like, wait, you were here for 1 year, man. What happened? So,
yeah, right. He has been one of the hottest coaching candidates on the board going back to his run at Drake. So it's going to be fascinating watching Tucker DeVries at Assembly Hall. At the very least, he's going to put up a ton of points. And my buddy, who's an Indiana alum and a diehard Hoosiers fan, he and his Indiana friends are going to have a ton of fun watching Indiana at least probably put up some high totals Listen, it's much better than Indiana getting Ben McCollum. Let's put it that way. Dead last in pace this season. Imagine Indiana fans going from even what Mike Woodson is and his dinosaur offense to Ben McCollum running the slowest offense in college basketball. Needless to say, I think they would be wearing maybe half a garbage bag at Assembly Hall next season, just from the sense that they're running a gross, slow-paced offense. Maybe not as gross and dinosaur-esque as what Mike Woodson ran the last 3 or 4 years at his alma mater. But we digress. Let's move on, Anthony, to the Midwest region, looking at, I think, the second or third game on the board on Thursday, a bet you have. So we went head-to-head to an extent with Louisville Creighton, 8-9. How about the 4-13 in the Midwest region? The number 4 seeded Purdue Boilermakers taking on 13 seeded High Point. Latest odds here, at least in regards to the total for this game as I pull it up here on the fly. 153.5. It looks like it's painted across the board with Purdue being an 8.5 point favorite. This line opened 10.5. So there was a fair amount of market steam on High Point. I think it got as low as 7.5. So a little bit of buyback on Purdue. How are you looking to attack this one?
High Point is a pretty tough solve. I think we all can say usually there's 1 or 2 data points of these mid to low major teams going up against superior competition where you can really judge, okay, how good is this team really? We really don't have that for this High Point team because they haven't played anybody. I mean, their toughest game all year was North Texas, and it's not like they played a particularly tough schedule last year either. So 2 straight years where you're looking around and you're trying to figure out what is this team. In the Big South, their defensive numbers look great, but the few games they played against top 150 competition, and that's top 150, not even just, tournament-based teams, it's pretty ugly how bad they are defensively. So, I mean, when you look at their numbers, like synergy stuff on, defending in the post, defending the pick and roll, it's all really ugly. I think Purdue can kind of name their score here. And then the other end of the thing is, what is Purdue's defense at this point? I mean, we're talking about one of the worst rim defenses, not just in the field, but in the whole country, which is amazing for, how far they've fallen from the Edey days of last year. And so, I kind of think that we have seen Purdue play these mid to low majors with the exception of FDU and generally have a ton of offensive success because of their how efficient their offense is and how well they shoot the ball from perimeter, how well Smith runs the PNRs. I think they can score what they want here, and I think they'll get matched by High Point for a lot of this game. And over 153.5 is what I bet.
If we go back to the beginning of January, on January 1st to be exact, and you want to take a look back, Anthony was not anything hyperbolic when it comes to Purdue's 2-point defense. To give you exact context here, the Boilermakers rank 363rd in 2-point defense since January 1st. I don't want to call, and this is definitely going to be a hot take, and I'm going to get called out for this, I'm sure. I don't want to call Matt Painter a Zach Edey merchant, but when it comes to NCAA tournament success, Zach Edey covered up a lot. Defensively, as you said, but think about all the calls. And I lost my fair share of money betting against Purdue in the tournament last year. But in that Elite Eight game, Tennessee against Purdue, Zach Edey bailed out the Boilermakers a bunch. Dalton Knecht was flame-throwing, especially in the first half, caught fire a bit down the stretch in the second half. But going back to this handicap, I agree. Purdue is a sieve defensively, to say the least, and there are paths to offenses on both sides. So I would either look Purdue team total over here or full game over, and I'm probably more inclined to take the latter, just based off of the fact that Purdue can be had all over the court, but especially inside.
Yeah, it was stunning to me how easy it was for Michigan.
Well, they have Vlad Golden down low.
They do, but it wasn't just him though. Like layup lines for everybody. The guys coming off the bench were getting to the rim at ease. Danny Wolf had efficient performance. I mean, I'm looking at the box score now. Yeah, 22 for 32 from inside the arc. That's amazing. I don't care who. Like, there's still a Power 5 team, a team with a top 4 seed. I would have had Purdue on complete upset alert. I just don't really know how High Point is supposed to scale up here in this game. We have no idea what they are in games against quality opponents because they haven't had any. So I'm just kind of uncertain about High Point, but I'm going with the over here.
You go back to this game stands out to me when Purdue took on Indiana, and the Hoosiers just had, speaking of Mike Woodson, had an onslaught of offense down low. Umar Ballo had an effective field goal percentage of 75% in that game. Malik Renew, 98%. And those guys are purely driven off their low post production. Maybe Renew could step out a bit and Ballo can throw up a hook shot or a little push shot in the lane from time to time. But Purdue, like I said, this is not an exaggeration, and the stats are an exemplification of that. They receive down low. Both teams have a path to offense in this game. I haven't bet it yet, but I have a strong lean to agree with you toward the over in this game. Let's move on to... Oh, go ahead.
One more thing. I pulled up the number. So top 150 opponents this year, High Point 5-1. Defensive efficiency was 151st.
Yeah.
So not good.
That's the hard part about, as
Purdue,
you said,
82nd.
With mid-majors and having a team on upset alert going into Selection Sunday like Purdue. This line, and especially the market movement, indicates that maybe Purdue is worth a fade, but can High Point match up at the defensive end of the floor? The numbers don't show that. So I'm with you. If you want any piece of fading Purdue, and it maybe sounds an odd way to think about it, but you take the over rather than bet and fade against the Boilermakers on the point spread, no?
Or you take Clemson in round 2.
I'm with you there.
Which I plan to do, and actually I took a Clemson Sweet 16 ticket, so that's basically the same thing.
The one, because we're not handicapping McNeese State and Clemson, the one issue I have with that, and for full disclosure, I have Clemson going to the Sweet 16 in my bracket, but when it comes to a betting standpoint, we're still in the midst of Thursday and Friday. I'm not sure if or how I'll bet that game if it does happen. The Dylan Hunter injury for Clemson is big, especially when it comes to their perimeter defense against a guard-heavy Boilermakers offense. As you said, Trey Kaufman-Wren should have a lot of success in ball screen action against High Point, and maybe not as much against Clemson, but Fletcher Lawyer and Braden Smith without Dylan Hunter, even though Clemson's guard play, Chase Hunter is still a good defensive guard, but they don't have the kind of ball pressure that they would without Dylan Hunter on the floor.
Yeah, it's certainly a red flag.
Let's move on. If we go across the board here on Thursday, East Region, Thursday afternoon, we got a bit of a gap, as you and I discussed off air. Not many great matchups unless you want to tune into a theoretical blowout between Auburn and Alabama State. 6-seeded BYU against number 11 VCU. I bet this one not on open, but I bet it on Monday afternoon. I was looking to get a 3.5. I didn't get -110, but I took the Rams at +3.5 over at BetMGM. There are still some threes available out there. I would bet it down to 3, maybe even a -105 on the 2.5 end if that's the best you can get and you're listening to this Thursday morning. We'll see how the market moves one way or another. Maybe it's best for you to wait until Thursday if you're tuning into this Wednesday night. You never know how the betting market is going to react one way or another. But this isn't your typical, or even not even typical, just Shaka Havoc VCU. If you go back to that Final Four run for Shaka Smart, they pressed end to end. VCU 82nd percentile per synergy when it comes to pressing to the half court line. So they do want to generate havoc and they do turn you over their fair share, but they're not pressing necessarily in transition rim to rim. Now, the Rams can generate their fair share of turnovers against this BYU team. The Cougars, 207th nationally when it comes to turnover percentage, not nearly as bad as the team that you mentioned earlier on, at least alluded to, in the Michigan Wolverines winning the Big Ten championship, tournament championship, but below average Division I turnover percentage when it comes to the BYU offense running through their point forward, Yegor Demon. And the other problem I have with BYU, 3-point defense. They're giving up the 15th highest 3-point scoring rate nationally. VCU saw a lot of 3-point regression, especially in A10 play. With Jack Clark, our guy from last year's Clemson team, transferred over to the Rams in the offseason. Max Shulga coming over with a head coach from Utah State. And Philip Russell, another mid-major transfer. They can all space the floor. The one area of concern I would have with VCU, maybe at a 2.5, little bit of a lesser tier bet for me when it comes to actual dollars, would be 3 games in 3 days, high altitude. BYU is used to it. Quick turnaround for VCU like it is for Michigan, and we'll touch on UC San Diego and Michigan here in a second. But that is the one devil's advocate thing I would say about the Rams. But stylistically, and per my numbers, I favor VCU. Again, I would bet them down to 3, and to a lesser degree, 2.5. Are you with me here, Anthony?
I am. That's Jack Clark, pride of Philly high school hoops, by the way. I worry about the spot, right? Because I think we've debated and discussed off air even, and people have theorized, why is the Mountain West, and we'll include BYU, so bad in the tournament? And is it the elevation? Like then when they play at elevation at home, they do well, and then they come down to these sea level places and they're not as good. Well, BYU doesn't have that problem because they're playing in Denver. And then also the turnaround is pretty quick for VCU to have to play a Thursday afternoon, traveling across the country, BYU, quick trip to Denver. So that part scares me, but everything in this matchup screams that this could just be a repeat of what we saw even Duquesne to a lesser extent due to BYU last year. And it's a little different BYU team, but not that different. And I think VCU has all the ingredients to pull an upset. It's a coach I love. It's a spread that I would project right around a pick 'em. So I'm happy to take the plus 130 with you. I'll join the crew, and I think VCU could win multiple games here. Like in my bracket, I've got them in the Sweet 16.
Yeah, and they would play, correct me if I'm wrong, Wisconsin in the round of 32. Right. If Wisconsin is able to knock off Montana as a big favorite.
I like their chances there.
Yeah, especially if they perform well in high altitude off of a quick turnaround. Granted, you're talking, 5 games in a week stretch? Less than a week or about 8 days going back to the A10 tournament. So worth noting there too, not just for the round of 64 game, but yeah, I'm with you, VCU against Wisconsin, especially against the spread. I may be fading the Big Ten all around in this tournament. And it's easy to say, well, the Big Ten hasn't won national championship since Michigan State going back to 2000. Man, how much has Tom Izzo made off of that national title? And the Big Ten in general, but Tom Izzo specifically, because outside of the national title run, runner-up status in 2009 against Tyler Hansbrough and UNC, what kind of big-time success has Michigan State had in the tournament?
Well, they were in the Final Four, 2019, right? That was the year when they knocked off the Zion.
I love that team.
That was
I
a
love
great
that
team.
That's true.
That was a great
Cassius
team.
Winston.
And that was a sick tournament too. I think people remember that tournament. For my money, the most fun tournament I can ever remember was that 2019.
A bunch of lower seeds.
Virginia,
or depending on how you
right. Auburn was really fun. There was a lot of crazy games. The Virginia run itself, but then also the Duke run, the Zion, all the drama that Zion and that whole team commanded as a presence at the top of the bracket, and then how they skated by, but then got dropped off. And Texas Tech was fun. That was a peak tournament, and Michigan State was a big player in that. I don't know. It seems to me that because the rest of the Big Ten has struggled, save for Purdue last season, it has almost amplified Izzo by comparison, because people are like, oh yeah, the Big Ten, but remember Tom Izzo's been to 4 or 5 Final Fours now. So
I will say, not to play devil's advocate to my own individual take, but and you remember this from when you used to watch college basketball heavily. Not saying you don't, but at least going back to recent years. The Spartans' transition offense, that's the one thing that if they're just running and gunning throughout the South region, they are much better, and the numbers spell it out, with Jeremy Fears at the point, a healthy Jeremy Fears, than with A.J. Hoggard. Tom Izzo would say it to your face probably away from the mic, how much A.J. Hoggard was a detriment to that team in recent years, and how much he would prefer to have had a healthy Jeremy Fears even last year as a freshman, and the ascendance of Jace Richardson, if we take it to another level.
in some ways, Michigan State is this year a post-hype team. I mean, the last couple of years, they were one of the bigger disappointments. And maybe, Kansas and Baylor getting those laudy rankings and having the impressive, recruiting rankings and transfer portal victories, whatever, they were maybe seen as bigger disappointments. But Michigan State, with the recruiting class they had coming in, they were supposed to be a lot better than they ended up being last year, going out in a blowout in the second round as an 8 seed. So in some ways, they come into the season now, there were almost no expectations. And they even fit the Ken Pom trend with the 0 for 39. Teams that are not ranked preseason, who end up a 1 or a 2 seed, never make the Final Four, never happened before. And in some ways, Michigan State, maybe because maybe it should have been a buy signal. Hey, everybody's off Michigan State now, and this is a more well-rounded team. And I think it's an interesting case, even though I'm kind of short on Michigan State relative to the other teams in that region.
Yeah, it's funny. We can make the case for why to like Michigan State, and the both of us will probably bet against them in the round of 32 and beyond. But let's keep it moving here, Anthony, looking at staying in Denver, actually, and staying in the South region. Texas A&M, you are Mr. Anti-Aggies, and A&M is a 7.5-point favorite against the Cinderella darling from last year for at least a round, the Yale Bulldogs. With a quick total here, I'm scrolling back and forth between point spreads and totals. We're looking at 139.5. There are a couple 138.5s juiced to the over and a 139 over at Bet365. Be sure to price shop the best odds over at thelines.com. I have A&M futures. If I had to bet this game, it would be Yale, but I don't think I'm going to touch it. And if I did, it would have been at 7.5 when I could have gotten minus 110 earlier in the week. So I'm pretty sure I'm staying away at this point. But you, my friend, have a bet on 13-seeded Yale. Why?
Yeah, so I think I bet the Ivy every year in round one. And I said, there was one year Penn was a 16 seed. They played, I think, Illinois in the first game, and I didn't bet them. But pretty much every other year I've been on the Ivy. The Ivies have always been good to me. And including Yale last year, which was one of my biggest wins. And they're in a similar spot this year in that 4-13 game in the top left quadrant where, maybe A&M isn't quite as buzzy as Auburn was last year, but I don't know. I listened to you, I listened to Stuckey, and we've joked about this team over the course of the last 2 years. At some point, for all the shot volume love, you got to be able to make a jump shot from outside 8 feet. And against this Yale team, who's going to pack the paint, dare you to shoot, and they're going to rebound well, that feels like a bad recipe for A&M. And I get that, I like Buzz Williams. I think he's a good coach. I think it's interesting that, he hasn't been able to recruit better floor spacers and shooters the last couple of years. And
he's never made the Final Four, which is an even wilder thing to say. For a coach that has had as much success and probably hasn't gotten enough love, whether it was at Marquette or Virginia Tech or now at A&M, maybe to a lesser degree, just because it's been less than 5 years with the Aggies, I think. But yeah, I'm with you. I don't know why he hasn't recruited better shooting.
Yeah, it's certainly weird. And the team that should have made the Final Four, of course, 2013 Marquette, but that 2019 Virginia Tech team, we were just talking about them, had a layup at the buzzer that would have set up an Elite Eight game against Michigan State. I think that was their maybe one of his best teams, going back to, of course, the old Marquette days. But I will say this: I think that A&M, can be a fun underdog team because of their hustle stats, because of how much of a nightmare they are to play against. But they are such a disaster to me, profile-wise, as a favorite, where they could have a bad shooting day and go 4 for 20 from 3, but for them, that's a good shooting day. So I'm happy to take the dog here, sprinkle some money line, took them in my brackets, and I even took some Yale Sweet 16 at plus 920. Because I'm not all that impressed by Michigan or UCSD. Like, if Yale had to play them, I wouldn't feel like, oh, Yale's drawing dead there in that game.
First, he's anti-Texas A&M, and then he's anti-UCSD. Just truly.
I'm not anti. I just, if Yale plays UCSD in the second round, I'm not thinking, oh, no, what's Yale going to do in this matchup against this team? So,
fair enough. I have Yale in my bracket, too. So, a little bit of a cop-out there. But Yale is going to compete on the glass in this game, mitigate A&M's ability to create second chance opportunities, at least on the offensive glass. Yale, low turnover percentage, but A&M's ball pressure can seemingly, and it's happened on numerous occasions, even against low turnover teams like Ole Miss, mind you. You and I were going DMing back and forth earlier in SEC play when Ole Miss blew like a 6-point lead.
It was amazing.
They kept turning the ball over, and they have one of the best turnover rates in college basketball, mind you. Zurich Phelps, if he has a Texas-like performance like he did in the second round against the Longhorns, shooting 2 of 19 from the field, A&M is going to get bounced. I would argue of the higher seeded teams, 5 and below in the tournament, A&M has the highest ceiling and the lowest floor. Because if they get to the Sweet 16 against Auburn, granted the spot was great when they beat them a couple weeks ago, with Auburn seemingly having nothing to play for, but A&M could win that game again because of Auburn's inability to clean up on the defensive glass, like was the issue last year, and it didn't matter because Auburn lost and Chad Baker-Mazara threw the game in the first round. But, as you said, A&M could also lose in the first round. Truly a fascinating case study when it comes to a coach. I don't want to say as heralded because, like we said, Buzz Williams hasn't gotten as many flowers as he's probably deserved. But still, a coach who's had a lot of success, a veteran-laden team. Wade Taylor can go off for 35 against Yale, and like Zurich Phelps, could shoot them out of the first round and take a 30-foot jump shot down by 3 with 27 seconds left on the shot clock.
You only have to go back to last year. I mean, remember the A&M Houston game? How insane that was? I think they were down.
He covered
9. They were down 9 with like a minute or 2 to go, and their ball pressure. All of a sudden, you looked up. You're like, wait, it's tied. I think they hit like 2 crazy threes at the buzzer. I don't remember the whole scenario, but there was definitely a player. It was like he'd only made 4 threes all year or something.
Anderson Garcia?
It might have been. It might have been.
That was wild.
It was a wild game, and that was with a top 5 team in the country. So, you see the ceiling. They're annoying to play, but if they're laying 7.5 against a well-coached Yale who can match up well with them, I'm happy to take it.
No bet for me there, but 3 out of 3 let's make it on Thursday out in Denver, looking at another South Region matchup. I think, and maybe this is just a theory of mine, but some of the last games on the board on the first day of the NCAA tournament generally lead to upsets. Maybe that's just my positive thinking coming into play, optimistic view on life, because I have a bet on UC San Diego against Michigan getting the 3.5. I would bet this thing down to 2.5. And I know I made the joke that you're anti-UCSD. Did you stay away from this game? And if you did, why?
Yeah, the game it feels toxic now. Like everybody on Twitter. I mean, this is maybe the people I talk to, but it's like you're an idiot if you're betting UCSD, or you're a square if you're betting Michigan, and you haven't heard about UCSD, and it's the water cooler pick and the trendy up. All these like things that mean nothing keep getting thrown around. When I look at the matchup, like a few years ago, I think we would have gotten UCSD plus 4.5, and I would have happily bet it with everybody. But at 2.5, it's like I don't know. We joked off air. This is like the Providence South Dakota State rematch, and it just really does give those vibes. And 2 years ago, I was banging the drum for the Jackrabbits, and I just felt like an idiot afterwards. And so now this year, I think
Baylor Shireman.
There's 16 games on Thursday. I don't have to bet all 16, and this one may be one I just sit out and just tell everybody else to have fun, and I'll be rooting on Yale right before it.
See, that's the way I feel about the Yale Texas A&M game, and I know. Comparatively speaking, you're getting a bigger number with Yale, and I get your point for sure. High variance team in Texas A&M, or at least from a broad level, high ceiling, low floor among the higher seeded teams in the NCAA tournament. And this line is sitting at 2.5. You made the comparison to Providence, South Dakota State. How about last year, James Madison, Wisconsin? Because all on Gambling X, which I know you've rightfully so have drifted away from, I can't imagine how much healthier you feel mentally not being as big of a part as gambling Twitter as you have in recent years. But the comparison I saw earlier in the week, to your point, UC San Diego is McNeese State. They're not even comparable. The market never bet McNeese State. I believe they opened 6.5 against Gonzaga, closed 6.5. Gonzaga blew them out. So the lines aren't close. The market immediately bet down UC San Diego. If anything, the line is more comparable to the game that you brought up, because I think the line was bet down very quickly in South Dakota State's direction against Providence. But this game is much more of the ilk when you think about James Madison and Wisconsin last year, because that was the trendiest upset. And I wasn't just trying to play contrarian. I was higher on Wisconsin than the market entering the tournament when it came to long-term projections. And then AJ Storr decided to quit right from tip-off because he knew he was going to Kansas. That's what I heard. I think that's actually a pretty decent conspiracy theory, and one that bettors should consider. Some of these players know where they're going in the transfer portal, and Storr didn't care what happened in that first round game after playing like a second-team All-American in the Big Ten tournament. So worth noting, just a general thought there. But UC San Diego, when it comes to actually handicapping this matchup, Michigan ranks 328th in turnover percentage. I have rehearsed this on radio hit after radio hit after radio hit, just like probably you have on podcast appearance after podcast appearance. UC San Diego's second best turnover rate in college basketball. So actually taking advantage of mismatches. I think the matchup stylistically is more suitable to an upset rather than South Dakota State and Providence, because Providence's physicality on paper and from the eye test overwhelmed South Dakota State throughout that game. UC San Diego, even though they have a size disadvantage, Michigan has struggled when teams have trapped the low post. That correlates with their high turnover percentage, as we touched on off air. Danny Wolf turning the ball over at an absurdly high rate when he gets double teamed. UC San Diego, because they lack size, is going to trap the post, whether it's Vlad Golden or Danny Wolf, and their dual threat big action, one of the best dual threat big threats, or dual threat high-low action in college basketball. And if you want to, because there are the people out there that are looking for that mid-major name, who's going to come out of nowhere and shock the world that you're going to hear on Thursday night? Aniwani Tate Jones. Aniwaniwa Tate Jones. I've said it 30 times now. Messed up my first go-around. I apologize. Aniwaniwa Tate Jones and this UC San Diego team advances to the round of 32 and gets to the Sweet 16.
I'll probably pick them in my bracket.
But you said you're taking pick
the first
to
game.
Win. Okay.
In my bracket pool, yeah, because I think Michigan will be popular, more popular than maybe they should be, because of the brand name of Michigan. But it is funny because I was texting people last week about this Michigan team who, rightfully got exposed after all those crazy close wins they had, and the sentiment was, well, we're going to look to bet against Michigan in the first round, and then UCSD, who was the most profitable team in the country this year, the market never caught up to how good they were, dominating the Big West. It was, well, I think I'm going to try to bet UCSD. So when the first region comes out and that matchup happens, it's like, well, everybody who knows college basketball is going to be picking this game. So it is fun. Like I said, I'm excited to watch the game because it's going to create excellent discourse either way. But it'll end up being that Michigan will win by like 1 or 2 because that's what they've done all year. And we'll look back and wonder what kind of voodoo magic Dusty May's been cooking with these last few years to get all these crazy close wins.
He didn't win in overtime against Northwestern last year, but I think that's the lone game on the big stage that Dusty May and
that
San
was
Diego
a miracle.
State
Didn't they have like a miracle comeback in that game too to get to overtime?
Right.
Insane.
One last run for John L. Davis and Vlad Golden, actually, and the rest of that FAU team that made the Final Four last year. How much time do you think Dusty May spent with Mike Tomlin in the offseason?
Oh, Mike Tomlin should be giving like motivational speeches to every coach on how to win close games. It's amazing.
Unfortunately, Michigan is not an underdog, I guess. So for that
Doesn't
reason,
quite work. Yeah.
I don't think Mike Tomlin is going to make an appearance in Denver on Thursday night, but otherwise, you never know. Also, you brought up a great point, and I want to get serious for 1 second. Not that you said it in this vein, but I think it's important to note. You don't have to bet every game, and there are going to be a lot of people sitting in front of their TVs, sitting on their couch. Listen, my wife's going to be out of town. She does not want to deal with me for 4 straight days watching college hoops during March Madness. And
now, did she plan that trip? Around
Yes.
March Madness? Oh, okay.
That was
All right.
premeditated.
That's smart. Yeah, that's good.
She wants to be nowhere near me. She'll talk to me the morning after, and I could have my vent sessions then, but she has experienced the ups and downs, the downswings of me during March Madness, and she has said enough is enough, and I can't blame her one bit.
Good for her.
Good for her. I agree.
She should go. Florida's nice this time of year, or wherever
She's going to Mexico.
Yeah, Mexico is lovely this time of year.
How can you blame her? I think her mom actually enjoys watching college basketball with me, but then again, she doesn't have to do it nearly as often as my wife does because, her mom visits a couple times a year. She gets to enjoy the sweats here and there. My wife has to come home from work and see the TV with, what you've avoided in recent months, the random Tuesday game, Maction, or whatever conference, low major conference it is, A10, I'm sweating VCU, or Dayton would probably be the team, an undervalued dog, and they lose, don't cover, and I'm upset for at least an hour.
Lose a 10-0 run to foul down 8 as a plus 8.5 dog with 8 seconds left.
Man.
Yeah, I think like I said, I still bet the sport this year, but the average volume for me was probably about half of what it usually would be in like a full bore season, and I made the same small profit on it, and I probably had about half as half as much stress. So I was like, this is maybe a better way to do it, where it's like, what, I'm gonna like slow burn to the grand finale. But I respect you guys for how much of a grind it is, especially now, November and December, with all of the work you have to do on the portal stuff. It's definitely exhausting if you're doing it that way.
Absolutely. One last thing. I mean, kind of twofold, but not really. Don't chase. This is the original point that I wanted to make. There are so many games, and Anthony and I just alluded to the volatility of the sport during the regular season. We'll get ready for the NCAA tournament. And that Creighton-Oregon game that we touched on earlier was a perfect example because Oregon was the right side for probably 46 minutes. And that game actually probably benefited bettors who took Oregon because it was one of the last games on the card and you couldn't chase later that night. But on a serious note, please, please, please don't chase, bet responsibly, all that good stuff. I'm not required to say that on any podcast, but I think it's important to say.
Agree 100%. Yeah, I mean, there's only 60 games or whatever, so it's easy to tilt and go crazy. But that's just the biggest thing you can do wrong. It's a better, and how you have a bad day and it becomes a disaster. And we want this to be entertaining as much as it is profitable, and so that's the best way to keep it that way.
Well said. Friday afternoon, East Region, Mississippi State against Baylor, 8-9 matchup. Equally as intriguing to me as Louisville Creighton. Maybe not the coaching matchup. Scott Drew. There are some headlines to be made for sure. I would say X's and O's. This isn't as good of a coaching matchup, but the point spreads are tight within a possession. So current line here, I think Baylor for a short time opened as a favorite, depending on the shop. But Mississippi State painted as a 1.5 point favorite across the board. I took the Bulldogs in my bracket. I don't think I'll have any action on this game from a point spread standpoint, but how are you looking to attack this one, Anthony?
Yeah, it's like the one true coin flip game we have on this 8-9 line. Like the 8-9s this year are a little more imbalanced than they've been in the past, but I just wonder if Drew goes to a zone, which I suspect we will see because this Baylor defense has really struggled, especially at the rim down the stretch run here. If they just go to a zone, what does Mississippi State do to counter that? Because they don't really have natural zone beaters. Their offense is kind of, they don't see a lot of zone. So I just don't really, obviously Mississippi State will be able to rebound out of that, but I don't really trust their offense. And that's why I still like this Baylor team more in the tournament setting when they get out of this Big 12 than I do a Mississippi State team out of the SEC that if you force them to be shooters, I just don't really know what they've got.
But the point you brought up in between there, and you know this better than anybody watching Syracuse basketball and zone defenses, if Mississippi State could generate second chance opportunities, Baylor is going to get crushed on the glass to me regardless, and I agree with you. Baylor getting out of the Big 12, VJ Edgecombe in a tournament setting. Baylor could very well make a run in this region, probably take Duke wire to wire, and then Duke wins on a funky call down the stretch. Similarly to the game we discussed from a few years back with Virginia Tech and Duke, and also the UCF and Duke game in the second round. Don't get me started on what happened down the stretch in that one. But Baylor defensively, 254th in defensive rebounding rate, and that's with zone mixed in, mind you. If Baylor was healthy up front with Ojanwana, I keep mixing that one up. Either way, Baylor isn't healthy up front. So if they had a little bit more size, but you're playing 5-out offense that at the other end is going to get crushed on the glass because your center is Omier, who's 6'8", who plays bigger than he actually is. But when he was on those Miami teams that, mind you, went to the Final Four a couple of years ago, he was the 4-man. So that's why I can't bet this game, and I would rather play it live because I think either one is a dog of around 2 possessions is worth a bet.
Yeah, I was really impressed by Baylor. I know they lost ultimately to Texas Tech, but, the way that game started, they could have went home, they'd be like, we'll see you next weekend. I mean, they were down 20 early, it felt like. Texas Tech was bombing away. They put up a 50 spot in the first half. But they battled their way back into that game and really almost won it late. And I thought that said a lot to me about where Baylor is as a team, because we've seen, of years past where Baylor has kind of faded late. The injuries have kind of hurt them. And even last season, weren't all that competitive with Clemson in that second round game.
But they missed every open shot.
Right. That was part of it too. Right. And that's always part of it when you're relying on really good shot making players. But ultimately in a coin flip game, I think I've got the way better shot making team. And I've got you said the Syracuse thing. I mean, how many times do we see Syracuse do this in March where they just come out of nowhere and teams start missing every open look against them? So, yeah, I mean, I'm ultimately going to bet on the talent of Baylor as a dog here every time.
And Mississippi State could very well struggle shooting the ball, and maybe Baylor plays a little bit bigger than the size than they actually have on the court. But even for just one more comparison, if you want to go back to that 2016 Syracuse team that made it to the Final Four, just size-wise up front, well, actually, Coleman was 6'9". Okay, I'll give you that. And they had a short rotation. So maybe it is comparable. The one thing is, obviously, that region was a little bit more wide open than Baylor having to play Duke, this good of a Duke team in the second round. But I'll give you that. Baylor is a dog of 1.5 points. I'm not touching the game, so I'll give way to your take, and you like the Baylor Bears catching a point and a half. Actually, one more thing on this game. Plus money on the money line, or do you take the point? I know that sounds like a dumb conversation, but it's worth having.
Yeah, I bet money line plus 104. I think it was. I have to look, but yeah, I took money line.
So you're one of those people that says, "Be damned if Baylor loses by a point."
It's funny. I go back and forth on it because even the other day I was staring at the book for a while, and it was the Xavier game, 2.5 and money line against Marquette in the quarterfinals. Oh no! And I was like, I couldn't decide, so I was like, you know what? Let me split it. And I split my bet, and when that 3 went in, I certainly was happy I had split it instead of just taking the money line. But at 1.5, yeah, I'm taking the money line. I mean, how many games fall 1? If I lose by 1, I'm going to cry about how it was a bad beat either way. So I'll probably just end up taking money line if it comes down to it in that situation.
South Region, Friday afternoon, the game that we hinted at off the top, number 6 Ole Miss against number 11 playing UNC, who knocked off San Diego State by margin on Tuesday night, and the Tar Heels are favored by 1.5. So the headline is going to come out, and hey, maybe I'll be one of those writers out there. Wrong team favored. Just kidding. I hate that headline, even though it does well for Google rankings. UNC on paper, over their last, I think it's 11 games at this point, is shooting over 45% from behind the arc. And on paper, they could deconstruct this no-middle defense. And for those who are unfamiliar with defensive schemes, no middle, protect the paint, and you allow your fair share of outside shots as a result. Maybe you overplay a bit, and Sean Padula gambles more often than he actually should and gets a stare down from Chris Beard on the sideline. If UNC is shooting 50% from three, it's probably not a blowout like it was against San Diego State, because I think Chris Beard will have more answers than Brian Dutcher did. And hey, if you want to hear the Mountain West trend yet again, I tweeted it out on Tuesday night, and it was more in jest than anything. But San Diego State benefits from elevation, or I guess lack thereof, depending on how you want to look at it, in their home arena, in the Viejas Center. Magoon Guath had just come back, granted. So rotation-wise, maybe he wasn't as healthy. Maybe he just wanted to get on the court. Defensive Player of the Year and Freshman of the Year in the Mountain West. But back to this handicap. If UNC is on from deep, I have a hard time seeing a path for Ole Miss to win this game, because, heck, UNC may just barrel through this bottom half of the bracket if they're shooting above 50%. And if that's the case, so be it. I'm not going to bet it, but I have some preseason futures on Ole Miss to make the Final Four. So I would love for the wrong team favored headline to come into play here. Neither team has a lot of size. We've seen Ole Miss have their best performances when they face undersized teams. You go back to non-conference play, beat BYU in overtime on a neutral floor. I know we harped on all of Purdue's issues earlier on in the podcast, taking on High Point in the first round, but Ole Miss was up a couple possessions against Purdue late in that game on a neutral floor, and that's an undersized Purdue team. So you can make the case, 5-out offense for Ole Miss. They could easily space out UNC to the same degree, even though UNC doesn't run no middle or drop coverage, and win this game by shooting 40% and above from beyond the arc.
Yeah, I'm concerned about the Ole Miss defense, not just because of the no middle, but just because they haven't been good for a month now. They are 92nd defensive efficiency since February 14th. UNC, meanwhile, we've seen their defense take steps forward, 48th. And it's not just three-point variance, because I pulled up the three-point numbers for Ole Miss, and they're giving up 36% from three, which is not, it's not good.
What stretch are you looking at? For are you talking just SEC play?
Last 8 games in total. Yep.
At the same time, because I was looking at net three-point clip like I brought up with Texas A&M earlier, over the last month, Ole Miss has the 13th worst net three-point clip in the country. Yep. So it really depends on what side of the teeter-totter you're on. Does UNC continue to shoot like this, or does Ole Miss get positive three-point variance, right?
Well, some of it is that Ole Miss has shot the ball poorly, which, that happens. That's whatever. But I'm more speaking about the defense here. Like, it's just not been the same level of defense from Ole Miss. And so that's where I get a little bit of pause about them. I laid UNC here. If you've noticed, I have a little bias here. I bet against Mississippi State, against Texas A&M, against Ole Miss. Let me see what else I bet this week. That might be it from I laid UConn. So you'll notice there's a little bit of a trend with where I'm going with this tournament. Kind of like my big picture takeaway, which is that I think the SEC mid-tier is quite overrated in the metrics. And I think I'm going to take a shot. And that could correlate really well for me or really poorly if I'm wrong on that overarching take.
No bet for me. Anthony likes UNC. So you would lay, and this actually plays into the conversation we just had, lay the 1.5 or lay the juice on the money line?
What is the money line now?
I think it's one. I'll pull it up here. Give me a second. Yeah. But I believe
under 120 is good for me.
It's 120 at FanDuel. You could probably shop over at thelines.com. But as of this recording, that's the only 120, minus 135 at MGM, minus 130 at 365, minus 130 at DK, and minus 130 at Caesars.
Yeah, I tweeted this last night. It opened 110. I was like, I don't think that's going to last too long. 120 is probably my buy point there. So, yeah, grab that last one at FanDuel before it moves again.
You know what's wild? Last point I want to make on UNC, less of a bet or a take, more so just market disparity and where UNC was priced in the market. Pre-tournament, Selection Sunday, 5 minutes before the bracket was released, UNC was plus 380 to make the field of 68, now plus 320 to make the Sweet 16. It's crazy how times change. And when I say times, I'm talking about a span of 4 or 5 days. But last game, speaking of the Big East, my take is I like your take overall about the ACC and the SEC to an extent. I only have one SEC team in the Final Four. Mind you can check out my bracket over at thelines.com. But I like the Big East in this tournament. Number 7 seed, Marquette, another team in the South region, taking on New Mexico, 10 seed. Your Lobos from last year, I believe we talked before the tournament, you had a Final Four feature on New Mexico. Clemson got the best of that.
How'd that go for them? Yeah. I'm
Mountain
in
West.
recovery, actually. Some would say that the Mountain West beating the life out of me in college basketball every March has changed me as a person to the point where I can't even go to war for them anymore. I mean, that used to be my league. I would live every night, kind of watching that league, especially Thursday night, the late Friday night tip-off.
Ooh, yeah.
And then I would ride, and I'd come into the tournament and be like, here's why this year will be different. And then I would just be wrong every year. And I kind of just got tired of that. And New Mexico, we're not talking Colorado State on this pod, but you could draw exact parallels between New Mexico, who went 4-4 last year to win the Mountain West, got a 10 seed, was 2.5 favorites in the first round, and got crushed by Clemson. There's like eerie parallels to what Colorado State just did and is now favored by in round 1, as far as Mountain West goes.
Over since 2006, Mountain West teams now 26-54 against the spread in the NCAA tournament. Obviously, San Diego State's run to the title game a couple years ago was an outlier. And I would say they were, a 7.5-point dog to Alabama in the Sweet 16. I don't think the market was quick enough to adjust on the veteran leadership on that team. And they weren't built like a typical Mountain West team.
And the way they got reffed, they were just bullying everybody that tournament. It was amazing.
I had San Diego State to make the Final Four.
Yep.
God bless you, whatever official that was that called the foul.
Creighton?
Yeah.
Yeah. I had Creighton Final Four, so.
I'm sorry.
It was tough. It was really tough.
Back to the Mountain West. Wrapping it up with your favorite conference here. Marquette is a 3.5, 4.5 point favorite. Wide disparity in terms of the point spread at various sports books. And a total of 153, 153.5. What are you betting here?
Yeah, this total keeps getting bet up. It doesn't like me. I took under 153.5. I saw it hit 154.5. I think it's a little high. I know Marquette wants to play really fast, but I think New Mexico's pretty well designed to, switch and force this to be a really difficult matchup for Marquette's offense. And Marquette's offense has really been stuck in the mud for large parts of the last month. And, it's not just the shooting variance there, too. So I think New Mexico can keep this game a little closer. And then, these Mountain West offenses don't really show up against these high major, defenses. And I know Marquette is far from a rim protection juggernaut, right? Marquette is what they are. They force turnovers and they like to play in transition. But in the half court, if New Mexico has to execute in the half court, I don't know. I think their offense won't be able to get the ball into the post much. I think they'll struggle, in this matchup. So as much as I like the guards, as much as these two teams like to run, this total has now gotten too high for me. I'll be on the under. And I do find it interesting. I thought after San Diego State lost by 40, we might see a market adjustment against the rest of the league. Hasn't really happened. But the market has moved toward Marquette since open, but not since Tuesday night. So it's interesting.
I'm really curious. You alluded to this with the pace of this game. I wonder if New Mexico might try to slow it down, or maybe that's just a byproduct of the way this game plays out, because Marquette's second worst defensive rebounding rate in Big East play, 245th nationally. They're undersized to an extreme degree. Even if New Mexico State or New Mexico is just missing jump shots and Donovan Dent isn't get it going like he didn't do, or I guess did as well, poor shooting performance in the semifinal of the Mountain West tournament against Boise State. New Mexico's might just contain on the offensive glass. And again, the byproduct of that would be longer possessions, more time off the clock, and less transition opportunities for both teams. And you look at Marquette's path to offense in this game, New Mexico can be had from behind the arc. Marquette has gotten off to some slower starts in Big East play, like we saw in the Big East tournament against Xavier. And the one thing, maybe it's not just a one-off here in the Big East tournament, just because Cam Jones had a good second half to that overall game against Xavier in the quarterfinals. But his shooting, I don't know what happened to Cam Jones from non-conference play throughout Big East play. If you look at overall three-point percentage on the season, 31.2%. I think he's shooting around 25, 26% in Big East play. And Marquette as a team had the fourth worst three-point clip in league play. So I agree with your take on the under, not just because both defenses may be set up well, but also because New Mexico may just generate a bunch of second chance opportunities. And again, you would get a slower paced game as a result because of New Mexico just having more clock to drain off of long misses and shot clock drainage as a result.
Yeah, and these are not bad transition defenses either in general. So, if this game gets forced just into 10 to 15% more half court possessions, the Cam Jones thing is weird because they were pushing top 10 in some of the power ratings at one point after non-con, but we've seen a little bit too much of the Shaka teams maybe peaking too early, and maybe this is just another case of that. I don't know. It's a weird situation.
Go back to the tournament last year, because this is a trend you're going to see if you haven't seen it already. Maybe you won't, and we'll just share it here. Shaka Smart in the tournament has not had very little success up until last year. Covered against Western Kentucky, I think, or right around the closing number. Covered for sure against Colorado. And the closing line was 3.5 in that game. They won by 4 against a trendy Buffs team in the second round. Now, they lost outright to NC State as a 2-3 possession favorite. But that's kind of the volatility that we touched on throughout this podcast. Marquette shot .431, 13% from behind the arc in that game. I don't think Shaka is as bad of a tournament coach as some will say, just based on historical trends going back to or post VCU Final Four run. And I know that doesn't have much to do with your total trend, but if I'm right and the Big East is undervalued in the tournament, I think Marquette can make a run to the Elite Eight, and I think they could win a slower pace, lower scoring game against New Mexico.
Could get a rematch, right? 2 years ago, it was when Marquette had probably their best team of this era, and they got beat by Michigan State in that 2-7.
I will be heavy on Marquette if that happens.
That's interesting. Yeah, they would be a good buy low. When the bracket first came out, I was a little down on Michigan State. I think you were too, and I was looking at it like, okay, who are there going to be their seeds? And then they get to 3-seed Iowa State with the Gilbert injury, and we don't know what they're going to look like. We're kind of uncertain on them. Then they get the 7-seed Marquette. We're like, Marquette maybe 2 weeks ago would have been a better 7 than they are now. And then, Mountain West, forget them. And you're like, I guess I'm penciling in Michigan State into the Sweet 16, but it's actually gone the other way now, where I'm using Michigan State in a survivor pool on Friday because I don't necessarily trust them to win more than a game or two. So I'm burnt. I'm in a pool where I have to use 2 on Thursday, 2 on Friday. I'm using Michigan State as one of my Friday picks because I don't trust them. And same with Alabama on Friday.
We have no idea. I don't think, unless something's come out during this podcast, we have no idea in terms of the health uncertainty with Grant Nelson. So definitely good points for both the Crimson Tide and the Spartans. I actually really like that take on using Michigan State in Survivor because like I said, will be all over Marquette. A little bit of a tease there in the second round if that is indeed a second round matchup in the South region. Anthony, really fun conversation with you, handicap in the first round of the NCAA tournament. Remember, you can catch Anthony on the Ringer Podcast Network, One Shining Pod to be exact, along with the Ringer Gambling Show. Write-ups to come on the Ringer as well this weekend.
Going to be doing some recap stuff, I think. The Ringer, we're not sure what the betting appetite is for our audience, so we're trying to figure that out. But definitely with the pods, going to be doing some betting stuff with them and maybe some video stuff. We'll see over the weekend at theringer.com.
I have been told by multiple sources to not boost your already high ego. But I will say, one last closing thought from me. and I mean this sincerely, and this isn't a joke or a negative toward you. If you could have told me, or if you had asked me, who is the one person you could have on your podcast to talk college basketball with in the last few years that I couldn't for obvious reasons, I would have said you. And I genuinely mean, I genuinely mean that. I think you're one of the sharpest minds in the space, even though you're a bigger nerd than I am. And again, go to Anthony's Twitter on X at Anthony Dabbundo if you want to check that out. But I mean that, man. Really fun having you on the show. I'm glad we could finally do this. One of the sharpest college basketball.
Yeah, that would be too kind.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I don't. Again, your ego is probably at like a 110 rating, so I'm gonna try to simmer it down to like a 75.
Yeah, I'm like the SEC in March, maybe a little overrated.
I don't think you're overrated, but maybe your point spread is inflated to like 18, and you should be closer to like a power rating of like a 5 or 6. How about that?
Yeah, I'm a vulnerable favorite come March. Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, we'll see. I mean, 2 years ago I had one of my best Marches ever. Last year I couldn't win a bet. So, such is the fun of this roulette wheel we spin starting tomorrow at noon.
Follow him on X at Anthony Dabbundo of The Ringer. Remember to head over to play.thelines.com to predict the final 16 teams in the field. You'll be entered to win $1,000. It is a free contest to pick all of the correct teams in the Sweet 16. Best sportsbook promos at thelines.com. Check out all of our great write-ups by myself and Mo Nawara at thelines.com as well. Head over to our Discord channel. It's free. Link is in the top right-hand corner at thelines.com. All of my bets in real time are there, and the pick that I teased earlier in the show will be in our newsletter. You just subscribe. Actually, you participate in a game over at play.thelines.com, like picking the final 16 teams in the field, and you'll be enrolled in our newsletter. That's over at play.thelines.com. Thanks for watching and listening to this edition of Beat the Closing Number. I'm Eli Hershkovich. So long, everybody, and good luck with your March Madness bets.